Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the All Me podcast. This is Don Hooten Jr., and today I'll be your host. We've got an exciting guest this afternoon who is a top-selling author, keynote speaker, and advocate. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Brian Cuban, the younger brother of Dallas Mavericks owner and entrepreneur Mark Cuban. Brian has been in long-term recovery from alcohol abuse, cocaine abuse, anabolic steroid abuse, and bulimia since April of 2007. In this podcast, you're going to hear Brian talk about why sharing his personal struggles with others is important to him. He's going to talk about the topic of body dysmorphia and that he struggled with body image issues since he was in his teens. The topic will then shift to Brian's abuse of anabolic steroids. Most people think that only athletes are turning to appearance and performance-enhancing substances, but listen carefully because the majority of users are like Brian. He had no desire to compete. His desires were to change his physical appearance. And as a result of his steroid abuse, Brian ended up getting a staph infection and almost lost his leg, and to this day still has gynecomastia, or man boobs. Brian is open about his struggles with addiction, and one of the stories he will share in this podcast is one you'll want to hear. When the Dallas Mavericks went to the playoffs for the first time since his brother Mark purchased the team, Brian had playoff tickets. What he does with those tickets is a story Brian will tell in this podcast. Be sure to hit subscribe and tell your friends about the All Me podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show. I'd like to introduce a guy who I'd consider a dear friend, role model, advocate, and also a Taylor Hooten Foundation Board of Director member, Brian Cuban. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Hey, Don, thanks for having me.
You bet, man. I'm excited to talk to you. But to start off our conversation, I think it would be best for everyone listening to this podcast to have an understanding of your background and your passion for sharing your personal stories about eating disorders and drug addiction. Brian, why do you share your personal stories about your struggles with others?
Because I feel that storytelling and sharing is one of the most powerful ways to spread awareness, break stigma, and possibly help one person.
I agree. And that's really the genesis behind the All Me podcast is we want people to learn from others through their personal stories so that hopefully we can make an impact and they can help make better, healthier decisions. So let's begin to dive into a few key topics, beginning with the discussion about body dysmorphia. Most people believe that only females struggle with the way they think about their physical appearance. Brian, is that true? And what exactly is body dysmorphia?
That is not true. Men and women both struggle with appearance and body image issues. Body dysmorphia, and that which is the diagnosis is body dysmorphic disorder, is basically when someone takes a perceived defect in their body, whether it's their face, their stomach, whatever it is, that may or may not exist, and exaggerates it in their perceived reflection to the point where it affects their ability to function, quote unquote, normally in life. Body dysmorphic disorder affects 1% to 2% of the population, men and women equally. And it correlates with steroid addiction, drugs addiction. It has a strong correlation to suicide. It has a strong correlation to eating disorders, just to name a few things. And let's also be sure we distinguish between cause and correlation off the bat. That doesn't mean they cause these things. There is a difference between cause and correlation.
No, that's really good to clarify that. I mean, is there, when we talk about cause and correlation, is there a cause of body dysmorphia? How does that come about?
There is no known cause. There are countless environmental, social, and genetic factors that can come into play, but no one cause has ever been pinpointed. Just like no causes, you can't point to a cause for steroid addiction, for substance use disorder, for eating disorders. It's a bunch of different things that come together. And it may come together one way for one person, and it may come together one way for another person. That is why we say correlation and not cause. Or a person may go through all of those same environmental issues and not have any issues.
That makes perfect sense. And this is something, when reading your books and hearing you speak and following you on social media, this is something that you've struggled with. When was it that you realized that you had body dysmorphia or you figured out what it was?
When did I realize that I had body image issues? Oh, I mean, from a self-awareness standpoint, those things, the self-awareness of it didn't really come until I got sober in my 40s. But I struggled with body image issues since I was in my teens. So it was really an exploration with my therapist to figure out what it was and what to do about it, and to figure out the diagnosis. Because back then, and even now when I was working on it with him, it wasn't a very well-known diagnosis, and it's not a very well-known diagnosis other than for people who have it, study it, and treat it.
And so having this, it's taken you years, right, to really understand what body dysmorphia is, and that it's something that you've struggled with, and you've obviously worked on that with your therapist and have realized that. Are there any signs and symptoms that would suggest someone could be struggling with body dysmorphia? And if so, what can they do to help themselves?
Yes, there are signs. Normal, in the specific situation would have to define what's quote unquote normal versus abnormal. An unhealthy obsession with one specific aspect of the body, talk about plastic surgery, constant mirror checking. And the thing with mirror checking too is it can be very shameful, because mirror checking can often be mistaken as narcissism, right? Mm-hmm. And this is something I went through. I had this obsession that I had a defect in my chest. And I would touch my chest and I would look in the mirror. And I wasn't doing it because I loved how I looked. I was looking at it. I was doing it because I was horrified at how I looked. I equated to not being able to look away from the train wreck. And this caused a dissension with my wife at the time, because she didn't understand and I didn't understand, and she viewed it as kind of a narcissistic tendency when it was not. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, because I remember, and my dad has shared this story as well, but when my brother began using anabolic steroids, he was constantly looking in the mirror, flexing his muscles, looking at the way he felt, but always checking himself out, which I guess would be a telltale sign that something was going on.
That would be, and it can be difficult to distinguish if you're a layman. Oh, he just thinks he looks good. He's checking himself out, something like that. When in reality, you were looking at yourself and it's depressing.
Yeah,
you're not cut enough. You're not strong enough, and there is a clear delineator between something that when you're achieving goals, even whether it's non-steroid related, versus an obsessive compulsive feeling that you are below average, that you are awful, that you are not worthy.
Yeah.
And so it takes really treatment to deal with that.
So would your suggestion be that
dysmorphic disorder can be very difficult to treat?
Okay. And who would be anybody listening to this podcast and they might be struggling with body dysmorphia? Is it something they would reach out to their family physician about, a therapist? Who would you recommend that they see?
You would want to research people who have experience with body dysmorphia. Okay. There are different therapies that work across the board, active cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance therapy, exposure therapy. But the reason why you want someone with experience, and they're not easy to find, is that it's not so much therapy, it's understanding the genesis of the feeling and asking questions. And a lot of those questions have to be geared towards shame, the shame that you feel. And the shame is specifically geared towards not feeling you don't feel good enough with regards to your body. And there's an art to asking those questions. Somebody may be very skilled at cognitive behavioral therapy, but has to be specifically addresses body dysmorphic disorder. So you have to do some research to find the people who have that expertise.
That's really good advice. When someone isn't comfortable with their physical appearance, they can often take drastic measures to achieve what in their mind tells them is the quote unquote perfect body image. And we hear of people turning to some crazy diets, which could lead someone to developing eating disorder. Would you say that your struggle with body dysmorphia is what led you to having an eating disorder?
Well, let's back up for a second. We also have to distinguish between body dysmorphia, because it's often used as this nouveau chic kind of term, right? Like something you buy on Rodeo Drive. Oh, I'm body dysmorphic. I'm body dysmorphic. We have to distinguish between normative discontent and a true disorder.
Okay.
There isn't a person in the industrialized world that doesn't look in the mirror one day or another and say that sucks, right?
Yep.
I'm a little too heavy. I need to gain weight. I need to work out a little. My hair is receding. Man, it's just I'm having a bad day.
Yeah, we're always judging ourselves, right?
That's right. You look in the mirror and says, man, I'm just not feeling it today. That's normative discontent. That is not a disorder. We all go through that. It's when you get obsessed with that and you take it to extremes that it becomes a disorder. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that anytime someone has a quote unquote, I hate the word, but I'll use it because people will use it, fat day, right?
Yep.
They're feeling a little heavy. Their pants don't fit just as well. That is not body dysmorphic disorder. Everyone goes through those feelings. It's when you obsess about it, when you try on every pair of pants in the closet because you have to find one that doesn't feel quite so tight or you won't leave the house, when you spend every dime you have on hair transplants and liposuction and bankrupt yourself. Those are the extremes that can define disorder.
Okay.
When you're just not feeling it, okay, you don't feel it, but you still go out and do your day, right?
Yeah. So I guess
we have to distinguish between that. So circling back around to your question,
mm-hmm.
I can't say I can talk about behaviors, but I can't. I mean, there's no way to pinpoint again because we're not talking about bright line moments. I remember a bright line moment when I started restricting my food intake. So I remember the bright line moment when I did my first line of cocaine, but so many different social and genetic environmental factors come together that you really can't pinpoint and say, this is when I developed body dysmorphic disorder.
Okay.
And did body dysmorphic disorder cause my eating disorder? There's no way to know that. It's certainly, we can say, looking backwards, that there's a strong correlation between eating disorders and BDD, and BDD is body dysmorphic disorder to save time. And so we can say that makes sense.
Okay.
My steroid addiction, we can say that makes sense because there's a strong correlation, but we can't say cause.
Okay. No, and I'm really glad you've really made that point that it's really hard to tie the two together. Do we know how people develop these eating disorders, what it stems from? I mean, is it something that you think is genetic? Is it mental? Where
we know that there can be up to a 50% genetic component of eating disorders.
Okay.
So beyond that, you can have to look at it's going to depend on the person. What's the environment? Are they perfectionist and it depends on the type of eating disorder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bulimia is not the same as anorexia. Binge eating disorder is not the same as bulimia. So I'm not a therapist. I'm not a researcher. So I don't think it's fair for me to start getting into those kind of analysis. But I think it's fair for me to say it's going to be situation specific. But we know that genetics can play a role of up to 50% or more in whether someone is predisposed to developing eating disorder.
Okay. Can you go into a little bit more information about some of the eating disorders that you've struggled with?
I've struggled with the primary one. I struggled with a form of, it wouldn't have been called anorexia. I wouldn't have, when I first started restricting, probably would have been called eating disorder, not otherwise specified. I don't know what it would be called today. But my primary one was bulimia, which is traditional, or my primary two were traditional bulimia, which is binging and purging, and exercise bulimia, which is obsessive compulsive exercise for the primary purpose of offsetting calories.
I remember, Brian, reading in one of your books, and you talk about the story you're in college, and you would have a very low caloric intake, and you would go out just on these long runs. And I have vivid memories of just reading that section of your book. Can you share a story or two about some of these eating disorders and what you were doing to your body at that time?
Sure. Well, I think everyone understands traditional bulimia, so I'll talk about exercise bulimia. When I was a student at Penn State, I would limit myself to a salad at lunch. I would go out and run 20 miles. I would come back and binge on a packet. And a trigger warning here, I'm going to talk about specifics. I would eat a packet of, I would eat a big bag of peanut M&Ms, and then I would purge it. And then and I even got into the use of laxatives. This was a very vicious cycle, and it put a lot of stress on my body. There were some mornings I was so weak it was difficult to get out of bed and go through my day because of the dehydration, the purging, all of those things.
Wow. So, I mean, you would have a salad, right? I'm just trying to give the listeners here.
Yeah, I don't want to get into triggering. I don't, in case anyone's struggling, I don't want to get into too many specifics so as not to trigger anyone who may be struggling. But yes, I would limit my food intake.
Wow.
And then I would also engage in binging and purging activity. And plus I would run 10 20 miles a day.
Wow. So what did you do to help treat this? How did you help yourself?
I did not help myself. I struggled with traditional sleeping from early to mid-40s until I went into recovery. Helping myself was going into therapy and getting into eating disorder specific therapy. So I would begin to feel better about myself. The same way I was able to wean off my obsessive compulsive desire to use anabolic steroids.
Mm-hmm.
It was a slow process of tearing myself down because there was a lot of underlying childhood trauma and dealing with all of that, and then rebuilding myself image from brick by brick. So I would begin to love who I saw in the mirror and not without the aid of an injection of steroids or cocaine or feel the need to binge and purge. And it was a process. There is no quick fix. People want to have a blue sky view of recovery, but it was a process for me. And I think people have to understand that it is a process because people get discouraged when their mindset doesn't automatically change all is great.
You're right. And a lot of people today feel they want to try to get from A to B when they're trying to achieve their physical goals, whatever that might be, in the quickest way possible. And we get discouraged quickly. I've struggled with the same thing when it comes to losing weight and staying fit. But another avenue people will take to achieve what they personally feel is the perfect body is the use of illegal anabolic androgenic steroids and other appearance and performance enhancing substances. Anabolic steroids are synthetic or human-made variations of the male sex hormone testosterone, where healthcare providers can certainly prescribe patients with these powerful drugs for specific treatments. However, like most drugs, they're abused. And in our first episode, we talked about how my younger brother Taylor was told by an adult influencer that he needed to get bigger, stronger, and faster. So he, like many of his friends, turned to the use of anabolic steroids, which ultimately cost him his life. Brian, what is your experience with anabolic steroids, and can you tell us about what led you to want to use them?
I was looking for a way. I can tell you that was like not loving myself for who I was. Thin, heavy, not muscular. I was always looking for a way. I was looking for a way to love myself. Well, I got thin and I still didn't love myself. I looked in the mirror and I still saw this horrific, heavy monster that was called a fat pig as a young teen. And so, okay, I'll get bigger and then I'll really love myself, and the girls and the guys love me too. And so it wasn't athletic. It was not related to any desire for athletic performance. It was to feel better, purely 100% to love myself and feel good about myself. There was no performance enhancement mode.
Let me ask you a question, Brian. When you're using these anabolic steroids, they're very powerful drugs. They work. In fact, I believe you have a couple of pictures in your book of when you're currently using a cycle, and you are a massive human being.
Yeah, they work. Anyone who says differently doesn't understand science.
You're absolutely right. The drugs definitely work. When you got to that size, and I mean, you've got a six-pack, you're this massive guy. Were you happy with your body at that time, even after using the anabolic steroids?
I was never happy with my body. Let me tell you how the obsessive compulsive aspect of it works. This was years ago. I was getting ready to go on a cruise with my father, and I was working out, and I got so upset that I wouldn't be able to hit the weights on the cruise. So I was meeting in LA, and I went 2 days early. I found the Gold's Gym. I took all my anabolic steroids with me and injected and emptied every bottle into my body.
Wow.
Those 2 days before we left. And so and another example of how addiction works, which is compulsive drug seeking drugs. I ended up with a staph infection in my leg from using a dirty needle. I almost lost my leg. It was very close. And after that happened, never used to again. I was right back at it.
So even after you get this staph infection in your leg, you nearly lose your leg, you go back to using the drugs again?
That's addiction. Whether it's cocaine or anabolic steroids or alcohol, that's how addiction works.
Wow. We go back to a time when the internet's out there, but we don't have access to information nearly what we do today here in 2020. How did you learn to use anabolic steroids at that time?
You have to remember, this is going back when I first started using anabolic steroids. The first year, they were legal with a doctor's prescription for, say, you wanted to get on a weight gain program. Okay, so I forget the year. So there was a guy in the gym I referenced who first introduced me to anabolic steroids, a former football player, gave me the name of this doctor out in Fort Worth and said, go to this guy and he'll put you on a weight gain program. And so I went out there and he wrote me a prescription for Anavar.
Okay.
And that was my first introduction to anabolic steroids. And this would have been, I want to say, 1988, 87 or 88. And then I met a guy at the gym who told me he had access to more potent stuff than that. And it all began. And he would get them from Mexico. I would meet him. He would hand me a bag under a table at a restaurant, and I would give him the money. And that's how I would get my steroids. At that point, they were now illegal. They were the schedule had changed, so you could no longer get a prescription like that.
Okay. So when you began using these, how did they make you feel? Was it an instant change? Did it take a couple of weeks? Tell us what it was like when you began using anabolic steroids.
It took time, but after a few weeks, I was working out at this gym, and I started seeing some pretty quick gains and noticing the weight change and noticing the muscle change. And so it was Katie bar the door, because it was never enough. I was never good enough. I never looked good enough. And so I was using and using and using without really cycling off too much. And by the way, I now have gyno, which is a side effect of that, man boobs. So there was that I deal with today, and it was like that.
Okay, and what we'll also do, Brian?
The only reason I would stop is I didn't have the money to buy more.
Wow, and what we'll also do, Brian, is we'll reference gynecomastia in the show notes to give people a definition of what it is. But essentially, it's man boobs. So obviously, they changed your body. They changed the way you feel. Did you have any short-term side effects when you were using these drugs?
Let's be clear. They didn't change the way I feel.
Okay.
That's the problem. I always felt like I looked like crap.
Wow.
So you might feel differently for a second, okay, when you look in the mirror, but that goes away, and then it's back to the same old addiction, brain-based issue, body dysmorphic disorder, that I always look like crap, and I was always this fat guy being made fun of by bullies and being bullied, and that's what took over. That's what drove me.
It's really hard to wrap your mind around that.
Yeah, in the moment, sure, it'll change the way you feel. You look in the mirror, okay, I'm getting bigger. Someone said something good about you, right?
Yeah.
But in the end, deep down in the little boy, I never felt good about myself.
And it's really hard to think about that, especially for coming from somebody that has been down, you've been down that path before. I've never had the experience of using anabolic steroids. I've had friends, and obviously my brother used them. But to think that even as I'm starting to add muscle and I'm starting to gain weight, to still think to myself that, wow, I'm still fat, or I'm not happy with the way I look. It's hard for somebody like me to wrap my mind around the way you might feel or others might feel after they're using these drugs because of the struggles that they're currently having.
I agree, 100%.
Did you have any short-term health side effects when it came to using these drugs?
Sure, there was. I am a firm believer that the side effects played a role in the demise of my first marriage.
Okay.
The anger and the rage, the shorter fuse. I wouldn't say, you hear the term roid rage, and I hate that, because you have to look at the specifics of the situation.
Yep.
Every situation is going to be different, but I definitely had a shorter fuse.
Yeah, I remember specifically my brother having a really short fuse too. And, it could be something as simple as, hey, you need to go do your chores, and he would just explode. But also on the other side of that anger and that rage, he would suffer from depression from the drugs.
Absolutely. The coming off, in the time when there would be gaps between steroid cycles, the depression was brutal. And how do you solve that depression? By getting back on. And for me, it wasn't just steroids. It was with cocaine and alcohol as well, which often which correlate with steroid use, drug use. So there's a strong correlation.
So you've also experienced some of that depression, some of those down times when you were using the drugs.
Well, and I was already suffering from clinical depression, so it was brutal.
Okay.
And so how do you solve that? Well, you get back on the cycle.
Yeah.
So you're not depressed.
Yep. Yeah. I've heard that story, Brian. I can't tell you how many times from former users and even current users that, they'll struggle from the depression and it's like, okay, what do I do? Well, let me get back on the cycle. That's when I know I felt better.
That's right. But in the end, for me, it was the superficial feeling better of getting back to that was always going hand in hand with the gut level, lifelong feeling of not being good enough.
Yeah. Let's talk about today. Do you still experience any of the side effects from your past steroid abuse even today?
There's no way to know. I've had arrhythmia. I had to have an ablation. Whether that's related to steroid use, it's hard to know. I have hip and joint issues. Whether that's related to the weight that I should have not been doing because I was on steroids, there's no way to know. Again, we have to talk about cause and correlation. I have health issues that correlate with prolonged steroid use, but there's no way to say they are the cause. It is the cause.
And one of the things that we'll also do, Brian, in the show notes is we'll post some of the science and studies that they've done, trying to tie the use of anabolic steroids to heart issues, not so much on the arrhythmia side, but, where your heart grows, your heart becomes enlarged.
Well, I have an enlarged heart,
Okay.
but again, I was also a marathon runner.
Yeah.
So there's no way to know. I do have an enlarged heart.
Okay.
But so there's sure. And one thing I feel confident in trending towards cause is my man boobs. If I hadn't used steroids, I wouldn't have my man boobs.
And what we'll do is we'll also put some information about gynecomastia in the show notes, number one. But number two, we'll also post some why that happens, because that's a question we often get, especially when we're doing our education programs. And we talk about how anabolic steroid use can lead to gynecomastia, man boobs. And we always get the question, man, I'm taking all this testosterone, which is, this male hormone, the synthetic testosterone. Why on earth would I be developing breast tissue? And the simple fact is we're obviously altering the hormones in our body, but we'll put all the science in the show notes for people to go back and
I'm
read.
not a scientist, but I can tell you that I have them. And there is no doubt in my mind that it is a direct relation to my anabolic steroid use.
As a highly sought after speaker, author, former anabolic steroid user, and advocate on this topic, what advice would you give to someone who is considering the use of anabolic steroids?
That there is no upside. There is no long-term upside. I know when you're young, you feel invulnerable. You want the girls. You want this. You want that. And I get that. But we should learn to feel good about who we are just based on who we are as people. Okay? Because it is a cycle and a feeling that can drag you down at the points you least expected in your life. And so if you're feeling the need to use steroids because you want to get the girls, because you want to be like the other guys, you just want to fit in, you want to be accepted, I think it's important to talk to someone about that, whether it's your parents, whether it's a therapist, because that's the surface. What's driving it? Why do you feel that way? Why don't we feel like we are enough as we are? I am enough. And so that's what I would tell you. I'm not going to tell you don't do it. I'm not somebody's parent, okay? And they've heard that, right?
Yeah.
But why do you feel like you are not enough as you are?
I love the point you make there because, Brian, I hope people really hear what you're saying and why you use them and sort of the reasons that you're giving right now, because most people believe that this is just going on in professional sports. This is happening in collegiate sports, or when we talk about middle school and high school kids even beginning to use appearance and performance enhancing substances, they believe it's just the athletes. It's the males and females that are trying to get to the next level. They have this desire to compete with one another to get to the next level. But what you're telling us, you've repeated this a couple of times, is that the reason you turned to these drugs, you had no desire to compete, right?
No, I didn't know it. No, that never entered my mind. I didn't play sports in college. That never entered my mind. I just wanted to fit in. I just wanted to feel good about myself. I just wanted girls to like me.
And one of the things, Brian, when we've surveyed the United States and we've talked to some of the kids in the schools, the top two reasons that they turn to appearance and performance enhancing substances is one, they want to look better, and two, they want to feel better about themselves.
That's right. And why And again, it comes down to why can't we do that without having to alter how we feel artificially?
I agree. And one of the things I want to shift gears on real quick and would love to ask you to share a story because it's always stuck out in my mind. And you've talked about addiction throughout this podcast and have shared many stories with us. But one of the stories I heard you share early on was how your addiction, your cocaine use, led to you selling some playoff tickets or trading playoff tickets to get money to buy more drugs. Can you share that story with us?
Sure. Back in 2006, when the Mavericks went to the NBA championship for the first time, I was deep in cocaine use, substance use disorder, and cocaine addiction. And I was so deep in it that embarrassing my family, embarrassing my brother didn't matter to me. Twice I traded Dallas Mavericks championship tickets to my cocaine dealer for $1,000 a cocaine. And the funny thing about that is at that point, cocaine, it was more chasing a high than getting a high. And it was causing me to feel worse about myself every time I used it. And I bought it twice and flushed it down the toilet twice.
Wow.
That's the quote unquote insanity of addiction, right?
Exactly. And addiction, Brian, is, it's a very serious topic. It's something we need to continue to push awareness out. And we need to let people know that it's okay if this is something they struggle with, but they need to talk to somebody, right? They need to get a responsible adult, a doctor, somebody that can help them because they're not alone.
Well, here's what happens. Okay. I try not to say need to. Here's why I would encourage people to do it. Because again, I'm not trying to lecture anyone. First, there is a very strong correlation, as we know, between drug use and anabolic steroid use. If you're using steroids to feel better about yourself and you go through these cycles of depression, you may turn to other substances to feel better about yourself as well, right?
Exactly.
So we have this correlation. It's a scientific fact that there is a strong correlation. And what happens is when we use any artificial substance, whether it's cocaine, whether it's anabolic steroids, whether it's alcohol, in order to change how we feel about ourselves, and we feel invincible because we're young. What is happening is we are kicking that feeling of lack of self-worth, kicking that can of lack of self-worth, of self-loathing, of not loving ourselves. We're kicking it down the road, kicking the can down the road to a point where it will come back. It will come back, and it can come back in a way that is not just long-term destructive from the use, but in a way that can be tragically destructive. And in my mind, it's not a question of if, but when. I can't say when. It may be you're using steroids at 19 or 20 or 21. That can may stop down the road at 25 or 30 or 40, but it will stop.
Brian, thank you for sharing your stories, bringing people into your personal life to share the struggles that you've had, because I think that's really going to help people. It's going to open their eyes as to how they can get themselves help and things that they can look for maybe in their loved ones or with their friends. Do you have any upcoming books or speaking engagements you'd like to share with the audience?
You can go to my website at briancuban.com with an I, www.briancuban.com, and go to my upcoming events, and it will give you a list of where I'm speaking in 2020. It is constantly changing as I add events for the year. Also, I have a book out called The Addicted Lawyer, Tales of the Bars, Booze, Blow, and Redemption, that focuses more on my struggle with drug addiction and alcohol use. The book before that, Shattered Image, talks specifically and goes into detail about my anabolic steroid use, and both of those are available on Amazon.
Great. And we'll be sure to also link to those books and your website in the show notes. And if you'd like to hire Brian as a speaker, you can find him on his website as well. We'll put a note as well. Brian spoke at our inaugural All-Star Gala a couple of years back. He blew our audience away and is a tremendous speaker. So, please be sure to get some more information on him. To close out the podcast, we like to ask each guest a few questions you might not have prepared for. And we like to call these our curveball questions. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions and just respond with what comes to mind right away. You ready?
Fire away.
All right. Being a public figure who has touched so many lives and someone who is very open about their life on social media, in your books, and when you speak, what is one thing that people may not know about you?
What is one thing people may not know about me? Wow, that I've run 8 marathons.
Wow. Okay. 8 marathons. I can't even wrap my mind around running one.
And finished all of them.
When was the last time you ran a marathon?
Oh my goodness, in the 90s, because I've also had my hip replaced.
Okay, looks like you're getting those distances up, following you on social media. Maybe there's a ninth one.
I try to get some running in now that but I have to be careful because I do have an artificial hip. But running it gives me that quote unquote the endorphins, and I don't have to get those through. I get those through life, right?
Exactly.
Instead of trying to artificially generate them through drugs or steroids.
Do you see a 9th marathon in your future?
No, okay. I do it. I go out, I listen to an audiobook, and it's me just connecting with nature. That's part of my mental health therapy.
I love running too, and I've kind of become a big fan of podcasts. So hopefully people are listening to this while they're out exercising as well. Second question, if Hollywood made a movie about your life, whom would you like to see playing the lead role of Brian Cuban? I
think you have to have Nick Cage because I get compared to him all the time. Nick Cage, I don't know who would play the young Brian Cuban, but at the weirdo late Brian Cuban, Nick Cage is perfect.
Okay, and what I'll do is I'll take your profile picture and I'll put it side by side with Nick Cage, and we'll put it in the show notes so that people can see.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Yes, I get that all the time.
Okay. Final question. So you've had an opportunity to travel the globe. I enjoy following you on social media and seeing all your various travels. Out of all of the places you've been in your lifetime, what has been your most favorite?
Well, we just got back from Israel, and I have relatives there, and I'm Jewish, and connecting with my relatives and going there for the first time, and just the history, the history is incredible. So I would have to say that was my favorite.
Yeah, it's
definitely. And was also the last.
Yeah, that's definitely a bucket list place I'd really enjoy going to. But, Brian, wanted to thank you again for your time, your support of the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and obviously your leadership as a Taylor Hooten Foundation Board of Director member. It takes a lot of courage doing what you do and sharing your personal stories with others to help them, and we can't thank you enough for that. Anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I thank you and your dad for everything you do to raise awareness, and the whole Taylor Hooten Board and all the employees. And let's keep trying to change some lives.
We will. Thank you again for joining the All Me podcast, Brian.
Thank you. Talk to you later, Don.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.